Okay, so I'm interested in how people interact who are served the same kind of authoritative top-down information and ideas. I'm mainly going to be following from the analysis of Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky in their book Manufacturing of Consent. There's also going to be some extended analysis and critiques of that by Professor Tate Bergman from his experiences working in Netherlands media and in his research. What I predict is that most of the ideological division that we face is an issue with the content we consume, not the experiences we have. And given that context, I want to explore possible models of deliberation and communication in a pluralistic society that faces multitudes of groups that have different conceptions of what the good life is. Um, so, of course, consumption is an experience, but it doesn't mean to say that life experiences don't shape our ideological and political positions nearly as much as media does. So with that introduction, I'm going to get into some of the actual research.
Okay.
So the first article that I read, it was called "The Limits of Deliberation," about the public's values by Mark Sittenfeld. Quote, "In the public's law, Emerson presents some inviting, albeit provocative ideas about appropriate role of the bureaucracy in our democracy. That said, overall, the book did not live up to my initial expectations. Specifically, Emerson seems to harbor an unrealistic notion of the capacity for the public to engage in deliberation about abstract values. So I feel like when I'm talking to other people, they don't, it's hard to really get down to like the core. I think the term would be like a dialectical discussion, where like you're discussing not necessarily what you think, but finding out exactly what you agree on. So I guess like I think like there's probably interpersonal communication in a lot of different areas of your life. But particularly, I think I'm most interested in like at your job when you're talking to other people and something political or social in nature, like controversial, comes up. How is that usually handled? And given your response, I'll lead into another article in Legitimacy and Democratic Deliberation, which presents different models. And I want to see which kind of models we see in our lives the most, because there are three primary ones.
So that can be challenging sometimes for a few reasons. For me personally, I am generally a more quiet person, so I'm not one to really bring up controversial topics. Um, and I think what I used to do, and maybe this is more just based on my personality, what I used to do more was just kind of let the other people say what they wanted to say and just kind of move on. Kind of a non-confrontational way of doing it. But lately, I've kind of started to develop um, kind of an interest in being able to discuss things and try to get to some, like you mentioned, some common ground, some common beliefs. Um, and sometimes I'll even try to ask maybe some thought-provoking questions um, that might, it might get people to think differently about something, while not necessarily, attacking or anything, because I'm still, I still want to have a civil conversation. Um, I'll bring up questions where, I say, well, how do you feel about this or this situation, or um, and then agree where we agree on things, and um, kind of just let them think about something from a different perspective.
Yeah, because I mean, ultimately, I don't know if you feel this way, but like my goal with deliberation is usually to convince the other person, but also be sure that I am open to being wrong. And so when you're open to being wrong, you don't outright um, try to authoritatively tell people the way things are, but just because ultimately you are trying to sort of convince them to some extent. Like we all have our personal beliefs, and when we're passionate about things, especially things that are more important to us, and it's also a lot easier to deliberate on things that are kind of established. Like I think like racism is something where it's pretty established that it's not
Right.
appropriate, but then there are other social issues where there's a lot less agreement, or at least there seems to be a lot less agreement.
Yeah. Yeah. Like actually just the other day I was talking to someone and it was interesting that we were talking about what would be kind of a controversial topic and we ended up just both agreeing that people should be good and nice to each other because that was
Yeah,
the most basic kind of common ground that we could find.
yeah, because I almost feel like a lot of the time it's not so much I I spend too much time on Twitter, so I run into these particular experiences, but it's not so much uh calling out who the Nazis are, specifically, but it's about like deciding what is wrong. Like, because I think most people agree that we want people to be good, but it's the issue of how do you do that? What's the praxis? How do you, and people's
Yeah.
perspectives of goods, they can be entirely conflicting.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and it's, people talk about, my reality or my truth, and I think that bothers a lot of people, but I think really what they're saying is my beliefs, and my
Yeah.
beliefs will, determine what I believe is good.
Yeah, it's interesting because you see like this academic discourse that's been around for a long time with like people having different ideas and that being okay, and particularly ideology. I've noticed a lot more people acknowledging that they exist in their own conditions. And it's kind of concerning because sometimes these nuanced concepts get reduced down to um, really simple, oversimplified ideas. But I think I don't know. I think there is noticeable progress in the way that communication occurs, not just in the U.S. because each country, each state, in my opinion, is on like a certain rise and fall. And given that, there will be certain struggles that that the entire nation has to deal with. So the next, going to the next article that I mentioned, illegitimacy and democratic deliberation. It talks about justice in democratic constitutional states from the standpoint of a theory of deliberative democracy. And this is a quote, sorry. Its aim is to show that the validity of a conception of justice and the legitimacy of political institutions and public policies based upon it can best be defended on the basis of a normative theory of deliberative democracy. So this article is presenting that that's the best model. So the problem is that um, the fact of pluralism in these countries, and it doesn't necessarily relate to race or culture, just any sort of pluralism. It could be religion, it could be sports teams, it could be race, it could be religion, just any sort of pluralism. Pluralism is like the existence of a variety of competing and often antagonistic and even irreconcilable conceptions of the good life held by individuals and groups in contemporary Western societies. These competing conceptions of the good life have both an individual and a collective dimension, since they may refer to a personal or to a collective conception of the good. So, there are three kinds of models in this paper that are being discussed as solutions, or like even just ways to conceive of reconciling pluralism, and whether it's a problem that can be, whether it's a problem or not, and whether it can be changed. So
Okay.
the first one that's brought up is neutrality, which basically aims to help everyone understand that pluralism is inevitable and eliminable. Public discourse should be restricted to the constitutional essentials and basic questions of justice and neutrality. Um, can't appeal to contestable comprehensive conceptions of the good. So essentially, it acknowledges that there can be different forms of good, different perspectives on good. In this model, there's an important distinction between public and non-public aspects of identity. The biggest issue is defining what the public aspects of identity are and uh, what are the reasonable basic questions of justice. So it's basically that like there should be some things that are off limits because we do have these different experiences, but it's also saying that there are these things that need to be deliberated. There are these things that need to be deliberated on and talked about publicly, but it's restricted to just the bare basics, and the issue is deciding what those bare basics are. So I think you see that a lot of time with like things you shouldn't talk about are like uh religion, money. I can't remember
Politics.
the other one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be like a
So
kind of perspective. Yeah.
is that basically just the method of trying to just find just stick to the basic fundamental, you know, things that people agree upon in general?
It's what people agree is necessary to discuss to keep everything functioning. So just the bare minimum.
Okay.
The second one that's discussed in the article is called perfectionism. It's sort of similar to neutrality, except it isn't neutral. The model starts by acknowledging the controversial, which is that the liberal principles of justice really aren't neutral. It enters into the debate aware that it is positing liberalism as the solution for pluralism. Its biggest downside is this direct and self-aware bias. If this is the system implemented, then it will be biased in favor of those who are already liberal in their conception of justice. If I understand it correctly, it's like the marketplace of ideas as it relates to reasonable justice in the public discourse, but it presumes liberalism to be the best option. And so I think this is
Right.
just the domination of a certain belief system given a certain country. Like, if I understand it correctly, it could be swayed in another direction in a different historical context or a different political context or whatever. This is one that's just, I think it's like fairly dominant in the world. And also a lot of this, there's a mismatch between what is done and what is talked about. So we're just focusing on what is talked about. We're not being very skeptical in our analysis, right? When it comes to what what countries say that they stand for and stuff like that. We're just
Okay.
focusing on what they say. And then the main model of the paper focuses on, it's called the dialogic or the deliberative model of justification. It's more dialectical in nature because it presumes that, quote, all human cultures that have animated societies over some considerable stretch of time have something important to say to all human beings, end quote. So the aim of the deliberative model is an understanding, or it's the aim of it's a fusion of horizons that people need to develop their understandings of other cultures so that we and the other learn from the interaction. It's different from neutrality because it no longer limits certain discourse. In fact, deliberation actively encourages the public deliberation of controversial moral issues. The part of deliberation that I get a little hung up on personally from this article is the ultimate goal, which is for social and political institutions to mirror public deliberation. So the goal is to have people change so that institutions have a model or example of deliberation to follow. And my issue with that, the reason I'm skeptical is I like it ideally, but I think pragmatically, the assumptions that it makes are dangerous. And this will lead into me referencing the research I've done about the political economy of mass media and the authoritative systems of information that we have in the most powerful countries. And also, like that information goes past those countries. It shapes other countries as well. So I'm kind of skeptical of this. I don't know if it's necessarily individual responsibility, but assuming that institutions will mirror the people if the people change.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah. And so it sounds like in your discussion with the other person, I mean, overall, there's probably a liberal bias to some extent because, like, liberalism, if you go back, it's changed over time. Originally, liberals were against voting. They thought democracy was dangerous. And so, like, to some extent, even conservatives, um, even like the most racist, bigoted people are still part of this liberal sphere of identity, um, which it mainly comes down to like economics. Like, there's a lot of there's some disagreement, but it's like 1% of the issue. Like, I would say that like 99% of liberals and conservatives agree on stuff. And also, like, you have more in common with another working class conservative than you do a wealthy liberal. Like, I don't really, there's a huge emphasis put on the distinction between liberal and conservative, but I don't really trust that. I'm kind of skeptical of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So next thing I want to talk about is the actual moving from the deliberative model of resolving pluralism to what makes me skeptical. So in the article Propaganda 2.0, Herman and Chomsky's Propaganda Model in the Age of the Internet, Big Data and Social Media by Christian Fox. To quote Chomsky, the essential ingredients of our propaganda model or set of news filters fall under the following headlines. The size, concentrated ownership, owner wealth, and profit orientation of the dominant mass media firms. Advertising is the primary income source of the mass media. The reliance of the media on information provided by the government, business, and experts funded and approved by these primary sources and agents of power. Flack as a means of disciplining the media. Anti-communism as a national religion and control mechanism. These elements interact with and reinforce one another. The raw materials of news must pass through successive filters, leaving only the cleansed residue fit to print. They fix the premises of discourse and interpretations and the definition of what is newsworthy in the first place, and they explain the basis and operations of what amounts to propaganda campaigns. So it's like the theory that it's positing is there's kind of, I think particularly in the West, there's kind of this nebulous authority that's kind of abstract and hard to see. So like in the example of media, you see with those 5 bullet points, advertising is the primary income source, reliance of the media on government, flack as a means of disciplining the media, and the concentrated ownership. You sort of have this nebulous authority that dictates what news is newsworthy and influences opinions seemingly almost precisely how the state wants it to be. Which I don't know if you would agree with that or reject that. Like in your personal experience, I don't know, do you agree with that theory that like there is this nebulous authority and like the media being produced is self-selecting to support the state positions?
So yeah, so I don't know if I would say it's just the state, having that influence. I would say it's, you know, whether it's a political party or a special interest group, it's some force, some nebulous force, but not necessarily just the state, but some group in that, in within the state pushing for their agenda. And I think we see a lot of the news sources, just basically um, delivering that message for their special interest.
Yeah, I think I would push back a little bit in that like I think among those political organizations and stuff, there is overwhelmingly a class interest. Um, and also like the state for the sake of corporations. Because if you look at the way that our government is riddled with I would characterize it as corruption, where money is votes in the government. They're openly allowed to, like with super PACs, anonymously, corporations are allowed to vote with their dollars. And so I think I agree with you, but I think that there is this shared class interest with a lot of these special interests. And it's not necessarily just for the state, but it's for the state for the sake of these giant multinational corporations.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would agree that there's something behind the special interests, maybe some similar um, driving force, like you were saying, whether that's for capitalism or commerce or just basically money um, driving the whole system. So maybe as a larger entity behind what I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, like it all comes down to this ideology of growth, of profit. I think most people can agree on that. The
Yeah,
disagreement on is on whether it's good or not, whether or not it's helpful or not.
right.
And so there's I don't remember who exactly it was from, but there's this quote that like ideal or growth is the ideology of a cancer cell. Because I think like a lot of people aren't skeptical and they think that everything has to happen in a way that promotes wealth or growth and profit. And so, like when you're
Yeah,
looking at solutions for climate change, you're like, we've got to figure out a way to make it profitable, or else we won't be able to
right.
reverse things. There's nothing we can do. It has to be profitable. So it's
Yeah.
interesting because in these other countries, you have these mass transit systems. Like I think, like I would point to China, where they have these high-speed trains and this massive investment. And the reality is that it isn't profitable, and it's almost impossible for me to conceive how that would work. But it's just that these taxes go to something that isn't profitable, and it's you have to make another measure for why it's good
Right.
besides just profit or besides just GDP.
Yeah.
And then also there's this I don't know what you would call it, but like the United States is just seven corporations in a trench coat. And that'd be my conception, that'd be my skepticism of the government and what it works for. Like almost conceiving of it as like organized crime. And you have these other giant
Mm.
things of organized crime, and they do all these good things. And so you'd say, why would you characterize it in that way if it's all for like for the sake of organized crime? And it's like two there's this progression from the and this is like a Foucauldian analysis. Um, there's been this progression from like the sovereign to like the fading of the sovereign, to where like this the sovereign as it used to exist hasn't really disappeared, but it's just sunken into the shadows. And we still really haven't progressed past this source of absolute authority. It's just become more nebulous over time.
Mm. Okay.
Which that would just be my conception of the current state of things. So going from that, there's um, from the article. Well, I just referenced it for the summary of Chomsky's work, but Tate Bergman writes in their analysis. Um, it's in the article Dutch Media, or no, sorry, relevant but long since absent, reestablishing a political economy of the Dutch media. Quote, scholars and journalists urgently addressed a core problem of journalism in the 20th century, namely the tensions that its commercial underpinnings create with its avowed task in a democracy. This article aims to draw attention to a chapter in the history of the study of the Dutch media that has been forgotten in the Netherlands and is unknown abroad. Additionally, this article argues for the revival of the political economy perspective, because commercial imperatives currently have a much stronger hold on the Dutch media than they did 40 years ago, as a result of the introduction of commercial broadcasting at the end of the 1980s and the increased emphasis on profit maximization in the struggling newspaper industry. A reinvigorated political economic perspective can shed considerable light on the crisis in which Dutch journalism arguably finds itself today. End quote. So that's just I think that this analysis has been massively limited. Like I think it's a fantastic model for understanding why. Um, and like I think you sort of agree with me that like at the end of the day, it's about profit. Profit is the bottom line.
Right.
And so
The
in this
idea
analogy,
that there needs to be, growth, bigger, better, more. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so in like this analysis, it's basically just follow the money, which I think works for a lot of circumstances right now. And that's something that Rutger Bregman, the book that me and Sam read, Utopia for Realists, that's something
Yeah.
that he talks about as well, where just like you need to follow the money, because this is where you will. That's the best way to develop an understanding and a critique of how things are working at the moment.
Okay.
And I want to jump into an analysis of Satoshi Kon's work. He's a Japanese animator. So in the academic article called Dreams and Nightmares, the animated worlds of Satoshi Kon, quote, save for Tokyo Godfathers, which was just a film that he made, far and away his most realist work, Kon's animations were out to capture the slipperiness of our subjective experience, especially with regard to the modern, tech-saturated landscape, by forever situating his narratives on the blurred lines between nightmares and dissociation, dreams and delusions, fantasy and reality, memory and movies, end quote. So I personally love all of Satoshi Kon's films, because they're about these individual aspects of conditioning, yet they allow for a larger critique to be formed of everyone. I think like I would describe that as we don't all have the capacity to change things, yet we are all still responsible. It's a very casuistic analysis, and I think this dialectic of the individual and the collective is really important when engaging with and analyzing deliberation. as a means of improving and coming to conclusions on social issues. And so I guess like I would ask you, my perspective would be abstractly at least that there isn't really a distinction from the individual to the collective. And without giving context, I want you to kind of like work through what you think that would mean. And there's a purpose why I'm doing this, but why would
Yeah.
there not be a reason to make a distinction between an individual person and the collective people?
So that's a very interesting topic, and I think you get different perspectives from people on, the value of the individual versus the value of the collective. Because in my opinion, well, so I think a natural human instinct is to say, what's my value? What's my worth? I feel like, to me, I am the most important. I am the only thing that's important for me. So I am first. So what's my value? What's my worth? Um, and people want to have individual value. But I think as a society, I mean, we can't get away from the fact that we live in groups as a society, and um, if if everyone is only thinking that the individual is, where all the worth is, then they might overlook the value of the society, of the group, and the needs of the group. And I think if I'm looking at this from a totally try to be unbiased and try to be objective um, perspective, the the group, the well-being of the group is more important than the well-being of the individual. But that's difficult for a lot of people to come to, because if I am losing something in order for someone else to gain something, then I am going to feel a loss from that. Um,
Yeah.
but another perspective is, kind of the um, what's the phrase, like a limited mindset where you don't think there's enough to go around or enough to help everyone or to help the group, to put the whole group in a good situation. Um, if you don't believe that's the case, then you're at risk of really losing something for yourself. Um,
Sort
so
of
I,
like a
I
zero-sum game where like everything is just distributed and like I think like that analysis of there it being a zero-sum game um limits the value that can be gained from like I think like synergy. Is that sort
yeah,
of what you're describing?
yeah, it's yeah, the zero sum game, or um, just a limited mindset where you don't feel like there is enough to go around. So if you are going to give up something to help someone else, you might put yourself at risk.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the way that I usually conceive of it is in the same way that our body functions. Like I would say that free will is illusory. Um, I think it's very complicated. I don't think you can deny that we feel as if we have free will. But if you think of like
Right.
the functioning of a body, you have cells in parts of organs, in organ systems, in bodies. And like ultimately there are things that do bad things. Like collectivism, this maybe isn't referring to the act the how collectivism is usually used, but like the way that our body collectively works, there are things that are bad in it, but it's like a very causistic, there's like cause and effect kind of process. It kind of goes along with my free will denial. And like there are also people who do bad things, but ultimately it just comes down to it's a less efficient functioning of the whole. In the same way that a body that has it isn't all oriented toward the same task, um, it's less efficient. So that would be my perspective and my way of characterizing it. And I think that sort of aligns with what you were saying.
Yeah.
Which actually, speaking of Satoshi Kon, that back there is Moromi plush from one of his shows that I watched recently.
The
Um,
pink guy back there.
yeah, it's a little dog. Yeah.
I,
So in every event, there are individual stories to be told, and there's a collective story to be told. Oftentimes, the widest story that we get is still limited to one group of people, one part of a whole pluralism. It's more expansive than one person, but I don't think it's nuanced enough to account for everyone or to be a reliable account of what happened. I think like the more expansive, the more people you can include in your analysis, because you can't really get rid of bias. But I think forming your bias or perspective, um, acknowledging the differences of other people, but trying to incorporate it into a more holistic analysis, I think that's more effective than just one person's perspective, which I think most people would agree on that. That like, of course, that's better. Um, so Jean Baudrillard's probably butchered that. Jean Baudrillard, his article War Porn. It's one of my favorite examples of a story being told in a way that seems to me at least to have room for everyone. So I'm going to quote. It's a larger passage, but I think that it's really interesting and important. Um,
Okay.
World Trade Center, shock treatment of power, humiliation inflicted on power, but from outside. With the images of the Baghdad prisons, it is worse. It is the humiliation, symbolic and completely fatal, which the world power inflicts on itself. The Americans in this particular case, the shock treatment of shame and bad conscience. This is what binds together the two events. For September 11th, the exhilarating images of a major event. In the other, the degrading images of something that is the opposite of an event, a non event of an obscene banality. The degradation, atrocious but banal, not only of the victims, but of the amateur scriptwriters of this parody of violence. It's do you remember the photos that came out of that particular
Abu
uh
Ghraib.
yes, yeah, that's what it's referencing.
Yeah.
The worst is that it all becomes a parody of violence, a parody of the war itself. Pornography becoming the ultimate form of the abjection of war, which is unable to be simply war, to be simply about killing, and instead turns itself into a grotesque, infantile reality show in a desperate simulacrum of power, which simulacrum is like something that's self-referent. It dissolves into itself, it's circular. We are powerful because we are powerful. September 11th was a global reaction from all those who no longer knew what to make of this world power and who no longer supported it. In the case of this abuse inflicted on the Iraqis, it is worse yet. Power no longer knows what to do with itself and cannot stand itself unless it engages in self parody in an inhumane manner. So, like, I think that sort of follows along with our analysis of our analysis, my analysis. Maybe you share this analysis of kind of the collective as like this organic whole, and so you see this dysfunction, which I think dysfunction and conflict is a normal part of interactions. I think that it eventually resolves itself or dies. Um, and so, like in this instance, you have, I think this analysis accounts for more. It accounts for the September 11th attacks, but it just feels like such an analysis of humanity as a whole. I just really appreciate it. I think some people would say that it's biased against America. Um, but like, I guess my perspective would be that 9/11 was bad, but what we did was worse. Would you agree with that? Or like, I don't know. That's more of a short response question, but
That's a tough one. Um,
yeah.
I mean, it was definitely reactionary and it was probably more overblown than necessary. But yeah, I don't know if I have a strong opinion about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's like something where maybe um I don't think that I'm necessarily correct. This is another example maybe where we have a different I don't think like I wouldn't say 9/11 was good. Like I don't think we have a completely different perspective on the objective good. But yeah, just our analysis differs, and I think that I also am a lot less personally attached. And I don't think necessarily that means that I'm more accurate. I think that that just means I'm more likely to cling to the first analysis that appeals to me and my experiences.
Yeah.
Okay, but going back to Tate Bergman's work, in Manufacturing Foreign News from Afar, Views from an Editor's Desk, Professor Bergman talks about how he believes Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model falls short. Um, and he references the research that he's done and his experience working at AP News and Novum News, which was a small commercial news agency in the Netherlands. So to quote from that, my main argument is that the news organization in large part succeeds in manufacturing consent among journalists who in turn attempt this for the public. Because of the utter normalcy or day-to-dayness of the social and material context of the actual work activities, specifically the office environment. In short, to my mind, the status quo remains the status quo. The propaganda model works. The news continues to get manufactured because the status quo is intimately intertwined with intertwined with, not to say constituted of, everyday lived reality. End quote. And so his analysis, he sort of holds journalists responsible. In the, like he conceives of this, I think the term is meso level. It's like a intermediate level. Um, where he because this is where it comes down to my we all don't have the capacity to change it, but we're all responsible. In that like we are, and this is making more of a moral claim than anything else, but we are responsible and complicit in our everyday activities. And so that could be um on the extreme end, I think like working for like a defense contractor, where your work directly contributes to this, to whatever is going on, or even as simple as a manager who is acting in accordance with the corporation's power structure. Um, and like I don't even know if I would do differently if I was in a
Right.
certain position, right? But my perspective, and I'm making a moral claim here again, my perspective is that while we can't change things, we're still responsible and complicit in what we're doing. I guess would you accept that claim? And also, can you think of examples of your life where yourself or others are complicit in a way that isn't necessarily immoral, but maybe contributes, is indifferent to, or leads to something possibly bad, even if it's like abstract?
Yeah. So I think about this for myself. I think about, I wish I could do something different, but I feel like I'm limited by the system that exists. Um, and maybe I could be more extreme in my actions and just do something that I know needs to be done, just regardless of any consequences. That's challenging. The one that just easily comes to mind um, is the cars we drive and like how far I drive for work. Um, for example, I look around at all the cars driving around. I think there should be more electric cars. There should be more hybrids, fewer trucks, for example, or low gas mileage vehicles. But then I think, well, I have you know two cars in our household that are not really highly efficient cars. Um, and then I think, well, if I'm going to really do my part to make a difference there, I would buy electric cars. But that's not in the budget right now. And so I'm kind of limited by the whole, system. Um, maybe not. Maybe some people would argue that I'm not limited and I can do whatever I need to do. And um, that's one example where I see, contributing, but also kind of feeling like I'm limited by the system that exists.
Yeah, and so I feel like that, like an onion, there are so many layers to unpack there. In that particular example. So like my perspective on that would be, and maybe this is a dangerous perspective for me to have, but um, if you accept the notion that we don't necessarily have free will, doesn't matter how much self-reflecting you do, you're going to end up doing something some way eventually, in the same way that a functioning body changes over time and has conflicting issues and works better sometimes. It's all kind of out of our control.
Yeah.
Um, and then also, I would say that like I would go a bit deeper in my criticism of cars and say um, land planning in the US has structured it so that uh, things have to be so spread out, and so that we do require cars. And if
Right.
you go back to I don't know when it would be, the 60s, 70s, 50s, 40s. But if you look at like the corporations intervening in these decisions for city planning, um, it was very, it's just so interesting how things used to be and looking at how they got to how they are today. There was a lot of intervening and lobbying from car manufacturers to specifically design cities the way they are. And also, you see the
Yeah,
demonization of pedestrians. Like even in the news, you had back, I don't know when it was, but there were these news articles talking about don't be a stupid pedestrian who gets hit by a car.
yeah.
As like streets can transition from being for people to cars, they would characterize these
Mhm.
people getting hit as just like complete idiots, which is
Wow.
funny. But then you also look at the number of kids getting killed, and it's a little bit hard to empathize with the "they were idiots" position.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so that's interesting. And also, like the only real solution to you, because you can't change the layout of your city necessarily. The only real
Right.
solution to you is just another way to help a corporation profit. Like there are no solutions that don't come down to because like you have these car manufacturers and their selling point is that they're electric. Um, and
Right.
it's better, but it's you can't have a solution that doesn't come down to profit.
Right.
So yeah. Um, and then also, so that so my position would be that you aren't held morally responsible necessarily, but it's kind of tricky. Like that comes down to my denial of free will. Like I think that ultimately the processes conditioning me to act in the way that I do are the same that condition a billionaire. Um, and I think that billionaires are still bad. They shouldn't exist. They have wealth disparities that are incredible and awful. That's largely hidden by capital and corporations with like it comes down to like you can't tax these particular incomes, you shouldn't tax my investments, stuff like that where they're able to
Mhm.
obfuscate their wealth, in my opinion. But yeah, no, it's really interesting. Um, so in Tate Bergman's article, going back to that, Herman and Chomsky in their analysis try to stay away from this level of analysis of like the individual responsibility of journalists, even though Tate Bergman, in his analysis, he understands that they're still being conditioned by these corporations to be complicit and to produce the stuff that they produce because that's just their job. Um, So, quote, we believe that our focus on media performance as opposed to journalists' thoughts and practices is fully justified. If a reporter deals entirely differently with an election supported by his or her government and one opposed by it, we do not feel it is urgent to find out what is going on in that reporter or editor's head. In following this dichotomous analysis, those facts speak for themselves, and the reporter's explanation and rationalization are of lesser interest. Um, because I think it's kind of tricky. I place like half value on individuals making moral decisions because I think that ultimately we will make the decisions as we are conditioned to, regardless of our,
Right.
I mean, self-reflection, something caused that and that will cause something in you. Of course, that will cause you to change, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't a chain of causes still.
Right.
Um, but also, I think it's kind of dangerous to deny free will and resort to a sort of fatalism where you feel like nothing is in your control. And I think that that can almost lead to like a wasteland of morality. And then, like,
Mhm.
if you believe that, because to some extent we do feel these pressures to behave in certain ways that are moral, um, that I think are socially, like, you can see, like, if I understand correctly, there are differences in morality depending on where you live. And I would say that those are, if, like, obviously, I don't think it's genetics. I think that that's socially conditioned. Um,
Right.
So yeah, I don't know. It's tricky. It's hard to I feel like it's a constant struggle where you'll never have a satisfying answer. We just kind of all it's a very messy process and we eventually arrive at some sort of something that's better. Almost like sort of an evolution.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, that's what I picture. Just like it's, you know, change won't happen as quickly as many would like it to, but there's naturally going to be an evolution. Something will lead to another event that causes change, that eventually things will evolve, I believe.
Yeah, and I feel like you have to. I feel because like I feel that you can believe that, but also that doesn't mean you shouldn't. I think you think this as well. You shouldn't vote. You shouldn't be immoral. You shouldn't go around doing bad things. You can believe that and also try to be a good person. Um, and like some people do think that like whatever political system they want is inevitable through that analysis. And I think it's sort of okay to think that, but obviously you can't just behave awfully, right? I think that's sort of that makes sense. You're able to reconcile that I don't have free will, but I do have to behave in a way that I have to force myself to behave in a way that's good, or I have to make good
Right.
decisions. Um, so to sum up from what Bergman theorizes in this entire article, it's essentially an analysis of the smaller systems in play inside the macro level of the entire political economy of mass media. He talks about material conditions that journalists exist within and works to explain why. Generally, they make the decisions they do and actively play a part in the production of propaganda. And when I say propaganda, it's not necessarily as charged as it is nowadays. It's more like, I don't know, like the Marxian conception, where like propaganda is just ideas that influence.
Right.
Um, so that's like
Could be
another
used,
example.
yeah, it could be used for all purposes. Right. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily inherently bad. It's just something that influences.
Yeah, like a sign telling you to wash your hands in the bathroom, I would conceive of that as propaganda because it influences the way people act, and that's fine. I don't
Right.
have an issue with that.
Right.
Um, so that's another example of going back to what I said earlier. We don't all have the capacity to change things, yet we're all still responsible. And so, like, I guess my conclusion would be that deliberation, it appears to me the best option because I think it leads to the most evolution of thought. It's conflict isn't a necessary and sufficient condition for growth, but I think that it is something that fuels it, and I think that it can be something that fuels it. I think that conflict and the decline of nations, the destruction of it's hard because some conflict like war, I I mean obviously it occurs and it's violent and it doesn't seem to serve very much evolution. I think there's better conflict that could be had. It's like for some people that's they don't believe in wars between nations. I think there should be class war where the
Mhm.
workers are more militant. And so you have that in like Brazil has certainly been that way. Chile was that way before. I guess sort of still um, with the overthrow of Allende and the U.S. backed, in my analysis at least, the U.S. backed putting into power of uh, Pinochet. And so like, yeah, I think the deliberation also it's one part of the solution, but I don't think it's all of it because I think that I don't know, I think things will sort of naturally progress and conflict will occur and I think that that'll ultimately lead to growth. So I think like what because that's sort of my praxis or my perspective on how we can do things. How do you grapple with in the instance of you using cars that contribute awfully to the environment, even at an individual level, how do you resolve that guilt? Are there like things that you do to sort of like make up for it? Because a lot of my problems I just intellectualize and I try to form some sort of analysis that I think is fair. Um, that doesn't necessarily relieve me of all uh, responsibility, but I think like my perspective would ultimately be that like a lot of it is out of our control. That's how I relieve my guilt. Some people
Yeah.
do it by like volunteering or like I feel like they
Right.
more actively contribute.
For me personally, the car that I drive to work is a hybrid, so it gets like twice the gas mileage as what my old car did. So that's one thing that I'm conscious about, when when I was looking for a car, I wanted to make sure that I could get really good gas mileage. So that's one thing that I do to, you know, I guess lessen my impact. Um, Another thing that I do think about, I think um, if I didn't have, so we, where we are and the school district we're in, that influences where we want to live. And it is about 25 minutes away from work. If that wasn't a factor, I would consider moving closer to work. I just don't think that's an option with our life right now. Um, I have had the thought of changing jobs to one that's closer, or potentially, um, I have played with the idea of starting my own business. So thinking about that, then I would be working, probably from home, and that would take that factor out of the equation. So there are some things that I've thought about. Haven't haven't really acted much, beyond the type of car that I drive.
Yeah, and I feel like even just thinking about it, being conscious of it is like I think that helps a lot. And I think like for me that even being conscious of that kind of alleviates some of the guilt um that I feel
Yeah.
where like it doesn't necessarily need to be relative to what other people how much they're considering what they're doing. But I do think that like as more and more people are aware of their behaviors, it's certainly like the broad statistical realities. I think that they're largely I mean they are shaped by individuals. And so acting in ways that are conducive for change, and also I think it's almost well, it's like be the change that you want to see, which I think is kind of cringe, and I think it's kind of a limited perspective. But like, of course, I want to behave that way as well. And one of the biggest ways that I do that, because I don't really do a lot. I don't really have a job. Um, I'm not in a workplace with employees where I don't know, I could even consider unionizing. But just in my interactions with others, I try to be positive and I try to be conducive for what I think is healthy change. And I think that that passion doesn't have to come off as very intense social behaviors, but I think just the passion in being conscious of what you're doing and being what you want others to be. I think that that's fundamental to more collectivistic thinking.
Yeah.
I think that's important. And that like it's not necessarily about you and if everyone sacrificed. I think that also if we lived in a culture that was dominated by people who felt that particular way, um, not necessarily more empathetic, but more conscious of their behaviors, it wouldn't feel like a zero sum game. And I think we'd be able to recognize the synergistic benefit. I think that in
Yeah.
smaller communities, that's often more apparent. Like just like particular communities or even some countries are more like that, it seems. Um, it would be awesome if the entire world was that way. And maybe we'll get there eventually. Um, but yeah, I guess that's my perspective on deliberation.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with that.